Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. 3 weeks ago, Vladimir Putin apparently stole the Russian elections, and yet we've barely heard anything about it. Welcome, Robert.
Hello, Bruce.
What did happen in the recent elections?
Well, as you said, it's a bit of an underreported story in many respects. These elections involved, I think, 450 seats in the Russian Parliament, and the outcome was Mr. Putin's ruling United Russia Party won about 50% of the seats available, and the Russian Communist Party came second. But the Russian Communist Party, although it got about 55 seats, it is pro-system. So it wasn't considered as particularly hostile by United Russia. What this means, to cut it very short, is that Mr. Putin, if he wanted to make any constitutional changes, and remember he's running possibly for a fifth term in 2024, will have the numbers to do so in the Russian parliament.
Many people consider this wasn't a fair election. What sort of concerns are there about it?
Unlike other authoritarian states such as Saudi Arabia and China, Mr. Putin, when he took power in 1999, he inherited quite an entrenched multi-party system. And he's got round that constraint by using a various assortment of tactics to win support for his party, United Russia. And these tactics include barring formidable opponents such as Mr. Navalny and his supporters, interfering with the internet or internet regulation, as Mr. Putin's supporters would see. For example, Mr. Navalny, anticipating the sort of tactics used by Mr. Putin during elections which are largely controlled by the regime. I mean, one of the things that's often surprising to Western observers, it's not an independently organised election process. Mr. Putin decided the timing of these elections, and the authorities have quite a big say in managing the ring, so to speak. Now, given that context, Mr. Navalny warned his supporters that Mr. Putin would try to organise things so that he came out with another sweeping victory, which has been the pattern of elections under Mr. Putin. And in anticipation of this, he put out an app on the internet which was called Smart Voting, which encouraged people to vote for any opposition candidate which had the best chance. But the regime promptly hit back by putting pressure on Google to remove that app from the internet, and Google caved in. So, yeah, there's quite considerable measures. Other things are what's called walk-around money, when just about a few weeks from the election, Mr. Putin's government suddenly makes cash payments to retirees, veterans, and also employees of the state. These payments could be up to about 15,000 rubles, or about $250 US. They're sort of sweeteners before the election, reminding people who's giving them the payment. There's also been online voting, which has been bitterly criticised by the opposition, because it often takes place in workplaces where employees have to vote in the presence of their bosses. So these sort of tactics means that Mr. Putin has been able to get round the constraints of a multi-party system to some degree, and he's been able to achieve the sort of results that he wants, which is, sweeping victories.
How many of the potential opposition candidates did you say were barred?
Basically, according to data that I checked before I came to this interview, there's no what's called anti-system opponents of Mr. Putin now in the Russian parliament. And that's been the case since 2016. And if you take a figure like Mr. Navalny, who was barred from the presidential election in 2018, is now incarcerated. And his supporters have been systematically removed from the electoral process. Some have been forced to flee Russia. So it's a very intimidating situation. And crossing names off electoral lists, people want to stand as independents. So this is, these are some of the tactics that take place. And, from Mr. Putin's point of view, the result delivered. He got the result he wanted.
We've heard very little about it. Why does no one seem to care?
Oh, I think people do care. Russia's a very important country. It's almost a sixth of the world's land space. But I think there is a sense that Russia has what might be described as a simulated democracy or managed democracy. And there is, I think, within Russia and outside Russia, a degree of pessimism that the system can be changed through, if you like, transparent opposition to it. People have tried that and it hasn't worked very well. And I think that has, so I wouldn't say there's indifference. Most countries like in the EU and the United States have both denounced the elections, the parliamentary elections, as falsified and fabricated. But Mr. Putin can conveniently dismiss that as anti-Russian propaganda. So I think that has accounted for the fact that Mr. Putin predictably wins Russian elections has led to some international indifference.
What does all of this tell us about where the world is headed?
I think there's mixed messages here, Bruce. In the short term, I think many people will see Russia as a darker place probably a darker place than it's been for more than 2 decades. Mr. Putin has even more consolidated his ever greater power within Russia. We can't expect any changes to Russian foreign policy. This parliamentary election has entrenched the political status quo under his leadership. We can expect Russia to continue friendly relations with China. We can expect Mr. Putin to continue an adversarial relationship with most Western countries. And we can expect Russia under Mr. Putin's leadership to have scant regard for the international rules-based order. That is to say, those points of contention between Russia and the rest of the world in places like the Ukraine and Syria are not likely to be resolved following this election. So in that sense, I think we can see in foreign policy terms from Russia more of the same. But in the longer term, I think the result could be quite sobering for Mr. Putin. The reason I say that is that there was only a 45% turnout at this election. And as we discussed before, opponents now have no real presence in the Russian parliament through the various tactics used by the regime to keep them out. Now, on the one hand, you could say, oh, that's great news for Mr. Putin. But it does mean that many Russians now feel there's no point in voting. And it also means that some of the key problems facing Russia, Russia's only grown, the Russian economic growth for a country with such enormous resources is quite disappointing. Just about 2.7% the last 20 years. It's only grown about that rate on average. And in addition, there is a huge problem of corruption. About 20% of Russian GDP is swallowed up in by corruption every year. And then, of course, the sort of repression we've just been talking about is going to continue. That, I think, is a smoking gun in the long run. Authoritarian systems often decay within. And I think a deeper malaise is affecting Russia now. And so, although Mr. Putin can take satisfaction that he has got the result he wanted, the efforts he and his political supporters expended in achieving this result will do nothing to win legitimacy for the regime. And in that sense, this system under Mr. Putin, we don't know when or how, but it could collapse like a house of cards. And that's what happens with authoritarian systems. They do not telegraph their problems in advance. Everything is rosy. And according to the regime, any problems in Russia are caused by Western forces. So, I think this is probably, in the long term, yet another step in the decline of the Putin regime.
Thanks, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.